Tonight, we're going to drift softly into a time not too far removed from our own, yet in many ways unbearably distant. It was an age of gaslight and soot, of cobblestone streets slick with rain, and orphan voices carried on the cold wind. The Victorian era, a time of grandeur and invention, yes, but also a time of silence, shadows, and children living on the edge of survival. This is not the history found in polished portraits or elegant novels. This is the quiet history of the overlooked, of those who didn't live in warm drawing rooms or attend fine schools. Tonight, we walk alongside the children whose hands were chapped and raw, whose beds were hard, if they had them at all, and whose lives were shaped not by dreams, but by dust, hunger, and the whims of strangers. You don't need to remember any of this. You don't need to stay awake. You're welcome to let your thoughts drift as we go, softly, steadily, through the streets and institutions of the 19th century, where tiny shoes scuffed cracked pavement, and the cry of a chimney sweep might echo through a narrow lane at dawn. Let yourself settle now. Feel the weight of the day slip away. And imagine yourself in a different time. Not as a hero, not as a queen or an inventor, but as a child who belonged to no one, in a world that often looked the other way. Let's begin. Imagine waking up before dawn, not in a bed, but curled beneath a splintered cart or beneath a soot-blackened archway. The air is damp. Your clothes, more rags than garments, cling cold to your skin. There's no breakfast waiting, no parent gently shaking you awake. The city is your caretaker, and it is indifferent at best. This was the morning for many orphaned or abandoned children in Victorian Britain. The term street child hardly captures the layered struggle they faced. These were boys and girls with no one to call their own, surviving in alleys, graveyards, under staircases, wherever the wind might spare them from the worst of the night. The rhythm of their lives was dictated by need. Hunger came first, always hunger, and to satisfy it, even slightly, meant labor, often illegal, sometimes cruel, and always underpaid. If you were small, and many of them were very small, there was always one kind of work that awaited: the chimneys. Chimney sweeping was one of the darkest corners of child labor in the 19th century. Not glamorous, not nostalgic, just soot, claustrophobia, and risk. Master sweepers would buy or hire small boys from orphanages or desperate parents. These children, often as young as 5, were prized for their size. They could fit inside flues that adults could not. The job: climb up into the dark shaft of a chimney, scraping the thick, tarry soot from the inside as you went. No ropes, no safety. Just a burlap cloth and your bare limbs against cold, abrasive brick. The climb might be 30 feet or more in utter darkness, the air thick with a cloying smell of smoke and creosote. The walls closed in quickly, and sometimes they didn't let go. Many children became stuck. Some suffocated. Others burned when chimneys were mistakenly lit. Those who survived often bore permanent scars, on their bodies and in their lungs. There was even a condition called chimney sweeps carcinoma, a form of cancer that attacked the skin from prolonged soot exposure, but that came much later. The immediate concern was simply survival. And when they weren't sweeping, they were sent to beg, or sell matches, or polish boots. The smallest ones might sing at tavern doors, their voices thin and cold in the fog. Anything to earn a coin. Anything to avoid another night hungry. Some turned to petty theft, not out of wickedness but desperation. A crust of bread, a frayed handkerchief, a lump of coal. These were the kinds of things that might send a child to jail or to a workhouse, where life was no softer. The workhouses. We'll come back to those. Even the language of the time reveals how society saw them. Gutter children, they were called. Waifs. Street Arabs. Descriptions that blurred the line between human and nuisance, between child and stray. They were at once everywhere and invisible, their small forms darting through market crowds and alleyways, often noticed only when accused. And yet, they were not entirely without structure. Many formed loose networks, bands of children who looked after each other in ways the world refused to. Older boys might guard younger ones. Street girls, too often preyed upon, developed keen senses of danger and escape. Even in the darkest corners, they carved out routines, rules, and in some cases a kind of dignity. Imagine trying to sleep again after such a day. Fingers blackened, stomach empty, head resting on a rolled-up coat if you had one. The city around you still moving, still moaning with carts and bells and footsteps. Sleep when it came was shallow. Dreams were thin. And yet, for many, this was life. And not for a day, not for a week, but for years. So, you see, it wasn't just that life was hard. It was that hardship was the air they breathed. That every day was a quiet battle for survival, in a society that often decided their fates before they could speak. And still, somehow, many of them endured. As we leave behind the soot and the sound of morning bells, we turn next to a different child, one who, against all odds, found his voice in this silence. A real figure whose name may not be widely known, but whose actions helped shape the conversation around child labor in Victorian Britain. Let's meet him. Many of the children you might have seen on a street corner in 1850s London were not born on the streets. They were left there. Some came from parents too poor to feed them. Others were born in institutions and abandoned shortly after birth. And some never even knew their names. Without formal registration, many had no official existence. No papers, no birth certificates. In the eyes of the state, they were little more than ghosts moving through the alleys, visible only when they caused trouble, or when tragedy made them momentarily inconvenient to ignore. Some found their way into ragged schools, institutions run by religious or charitable groups to teach reading, writing, and simple trades. These schools were underfunded and overcrowded, but they offered something that many children had never received before: warmth, attention, and occasionally a biscuit. Even there, though, the balance between help and control was fragile. The line between charity and discipline often blurred. A stern teacher might strike a child for arriving late. Cleanliness was demanded, though soap was a luxury. And if a child misbehaved or begged too openly on the streets, their place might be taken away without warning. Outside the schools, the city was both a threat and a teacher. Children learned to read faces, who might give them bread, who might chase them off, who might do worse. They knew which vendors left scraps out back, which doorways offered the driest shelter, which corners the constable never checked. And then, of course, there were the sweep boys. Chimney sweeps often lived with their masters, though lived is perhaps too kind a word. They might sleep on piles of rags in the corner of a workshop or in a shared shed behind the house. Discipline was brutal, meals were rare, and affection was almost non-existent. Some masters forced the boys to sleep in soot piles, under the belief that it would make them more accustomed to the filth. When they resisted chimney work, especially the terrifying first climb, up a dark and narrowing shaft, they were sometimes pricked with pins or burned with hot shovels to force them upward. Others were denied food until the job was done. To train for the chimneys, boys would practice in wooden mock-ups with narrowing shafts, greased walls, and hanging soot bags. But nothing truly prepared them for the reality. Once inside a live flue, there was no turning around. Limbs scraped, lungs filled, voices echoed strangely inside the brick. And at the top, if they made it, a small flap of daylight would be their only reward. In winter, the work was colder, though the soot offered some insulation. In summer, the brick grew hot, and the risk of burns increased. No season was kind. Imagine now, if you will, a day where you've finished your climbs. Perhaps your knees are bleeding from brick scrapes. Your back is sore from twisting. You've had no food since dawn. And now you're sent into the street to beg for your supper, or find it in bins. This was not a punishment. This was routine. And yet, in all this hardship, there were small acts of resilience. Some boys sang as they worked. Others made a game of dodging constables or counting the number of rooftops they could see from a certain stack. A few, with remarkable determination, taught themselves to read by matching street signs with the letters they heard spoken by charity workers. Human spirit, even under soot and sorrow, flickered like a stubborn flame. We often look back at the Victorian period as one of formality and invention, of telegrams and top hats, steam engines and expanding empires. But underneath the elegance and brass fittings were children in patched trousers, barefoot in the frost, learning to survive in a city that hardly noticed them. So many stories were never written. So many names never recorded. But they were there, lining the alleys, slipping between footsteps, waking each morning to a sky that promised nothing, and giving what little strength they had to a world that demanded everything. As the street lamps flicker on and the soot settles into the cobbles, let's leave this corner of the city behind. Let the wind carry us gently now, from grime to grit, from survival to change. For in the midst of this hardship, a few voices began to rise, softly at first, calling out against the cruelty. Voices who once had nothing, and then found a way to speak. Let us now meet one of them. As we step away from the soot-covered rooftops and the hollow-eyed children of London's alleys, let us follow the quiet path of change. Change rarely arrives in great gusts. It comes slowly, like dawn creeping through a shuttered room. One man, more than most, lit a candle in that darkness. His name was Anthony Ashley Cooper, known later as the 7th Earl of Shaftesbury. A nobleman by birth, born into wealth and comfort. But unlike many of his peers, Lord Shaftesbury chose not to look away from the children hidden in shadows. He saw them and, more importantly, he refused to forget them. Let's go back to his beginning. Anthony was born in 1801 into an aristocratic family, the kind that lived in sprawling estates and spoke in careful, educated tones. But his childhood was not a warm one. His parents, distant and emotionally cold, left much of his care to servants and tutors. It's said that even as a child, he longed not for riches or influence, but for kindness, something he felt only in the presence of a gentle housekeeper named Maria. That early hunger for compassion, so often unmet, would quietly shape the man he would become. As he grew, Shaftesbury was educated at Harrow and then Christ Church, Oxford, following the path expected of a man of his status. But it wasn't the grandeur of Westminster or the language of the elite that stirred him. It was the plight of the poor. In 1833, at the age of 32, he entered Parliament, and soon after, he made a choice that surprised many. He aligned himself not with the rich industrialists, but with the powerless. His first major campaign was against the widespread abuse of children in factories. He visited textile mills in the north, dark, deafening places where children worked 16-hour days among dangerous machines. He saw young girls with missing fingers, boys stooped and coughing in their teens. And he carried these sights back to London, where he spoke of them not with outrage, but with calm, persistent truth. He proposed the Factory Act of 1833, which, despite resistance, placed limits on the hours children could work. It wasn't perfect. Enforcement was weak. Loopholes remained. But it was a beginning. And Shaftesbury was not finished. Soon, his attention turned to the chimney sweeps. He'd heard their stories. Children trapped in flues, burned by hot bricks, coughing through their youth and dying in early manhood. In 1840, he introduced a bill aimed at ending child chimney sweeps entirely. The bill passed. And yet, in many cities, the practice continued in secret. Boys still climbed, still coughed, still cried. So Shaftesbury returned, again and again, in 1842, then again in 1853, then 1864. With each attempt, he tightened the law, pushed for inspections, demanded accountability. He was relentless, not loud, not flamboyant, but steady like a river smoothing stone. In his later years, he championed ragged schools, seeing education as a pathway out of poverty. He believed that every child, no matter how poor, how lost, how forgotten, deserved the dignity of learning. Not just letters and sums, but worth, a sense that they mattered. He would visit these schools unannounced, kneeling beside barefoot children as they traced letters with soot-stained fingers. He would speak to them not from a stage, but face to face, one human to another, and they remembered him for it. But his advocacy came at a cost. He was mocked by some in Parliament, called a sentimentalist. Industrialists accused him of threatening economic progress. Even within his own class, there were whispers that he had lost his way. Still he continued. In total, Lord Shaftesbury worked for over 50 years on behalf of the poor. Not in one grand gesture, but through dozens of bills, countless speeches, and an unyielding presence in the corridors of power. When others tired, he persisted. When others moved on, he stayed. He died in 1885, quietly as he had lived. On the day of his funeral, thousands lined the streets, not nobles in velvet coats, but working men and women, orphans, factory girls, chimney sweep boys grown old. Many held flowers, some wept, and all of them knew that someone once had stood for them. There's a statue of him now, in Piccadilly Circus. You may have seen it, the angel with outstretched wings, called the Shaftesbury Memorial. Most pass by it without knowing the man beneath. But the children he fought for, they knew. And perhaps, in some quiet corner of your imagination, you know now too. So as the candle of his life flickers gently out, we carry forward into the next room of this old Victorian world. We move from the man who tried to save children to the places where those children were sent when the world could no longer care for them. Let us now wander the cold halls and hidden histories of the Foundling hospitals, where lost children were given new names, and sometimes a second chance. Now, imagine yourself in a different part of Victorian London. It's still raining. A soft, persistent drizzle that drips from iron fences and streaks the sooty windows. You pass through quieter streets now, less crowded than the market lanes, more hushed than the factory quarters. The buildings here are stately, symmetrical, tall, unfeeling. At the end of one long, straight road stands a high-walled institution with a solemn iron gate. Behind it, the Foundling Hospital. It looks like any respectable building, a grand structure of red brick and stone. But inside were children whose names no one ever intended to remember. The Foundling Hospital was not a hospital in the modern sense. It was in many ways an orphanage, a place meant to receive infants whose mothers could not keep them, whether from poverty, shame, or desperation. And in the 18th and 19th centuries, desperation was everywhere. The London Foundling Hospital had been founded earlier in 1739 by a man named Thomas Coram, a retired sea captain who had grown weary of finding abandoned babies in the gutters and alleys of London. He envisioned a sanctuary, an institution that would offer these little lives a sliver of protection. Second beginning. By the Victorian era, that vision had become a carefully regimented system. Mothers who wished to leave their child at the hospital had to follow a strict process. They would come in secret, often veiled or cloaked, and hand over their baby through a kind of turnstile or hatch. No questions asked. In return, they received a token. A button, a scrap of cloth, a playing card cut in half. This was their receipt, so to speak. A sign that the child left behind was once theirs. If they returned one day to reclaim them, the token might help reunite them. But most never did. And so, within those high walls, the infants were renamed, numbered, and quietly absorbed into the system. From the outside, this seems merciful, a haven perhaps. But life within the Foundling institutions was not easy. While the intentions were noble, the reality was more complicated. The babies, when first taken in, were often placed with wet nurses, women who lived in the countryside and were paid to care for multiple infants at once. Some of these nurses were kind. Others saw the babies more as burdens than blessings. Mortality rates were high. Records suggest that in some years, more than half the children placed with nurses died before reaching the hospital proper. Those who survived were brought back around the age of 5 or 6 to live in the institutional buildings. There they were raised with strict discipline, rigid schedules, and very little personal affection. The hospital believed in order, in cleanliness, and in moral instruction. But comfort was in short supply. Children wore identical uniforms. Their hair was cropped short. Their days were measured by bells. Wake, wash, prayer, school, chores, prayer again. Smiles were rare. Hugs even rarer. Many grew up not knowing their real names, their birthdays, or why they had been left behind. When they asked, They were often told that their mothers were sick or gone. The truth, whatever it was buried under decades of silence and secrecy. Still, some children found small joys. A kind teacher, a warm meal on a Sunday, a brief glimpse of music or art. In fact, the Foundling Hospital became known in the 19th century for its connection to the arts. Composers like Handel donated performances. Wealthy patrons supported the institution not just with money, but with paintings, concerts, and visits. Imagine being a child in that gray world, and hearing the strains of a harp for the first time echo down the stone corridor. A sound soft enough to reach even the corners of a tired heart. For the public, the hospital was a symbol of charity and decency. Tours were even given. Wealthy Victorians would come to view the children singing or studying, satisfied that their donations were helping. But the children themselves were often viewed more as symbols than souls. When they reached adolescence, many were apprenticed out. The girls might be sent to work in domestic service, the boys to farms or trades. Few were adopted. Most simply aged out, slipping from one institutional world into another, where the uniform changed but the silence remained. And yet, within these walls, among the chalkboards and prayer books, mysteries persisted. Some of the tokens left by mothers, scraps of lace, beads, coins with initials, were lovingly preserved in secret drawers. We still have them. And historians today pore over these fragments, trying to connect them to real lives. Who was the mother who left a thimble wrapped in linen? What became of the girl who clutched a blue ribbon as she cried herself to sleep? These tiny artifacts remind us that each child, nameless or not, had a beginning, and someone once who tried to love them. And in recent years, a quiet movement has grown to uncover more of these stories, to gently lift the veil of institutional forgetfulness, to give those lost names a voice, even if only in a whisper. So as we leave the Foundling Hospital behind, its dormitories cold, its secrets tucked in linen bundles, we step into the light of a different world. A world not of suffering but of contrast. For even in the same city, even on the same street, some children lived lives entirely untouched by hardship. They had nannies, tutors, toys made of ivory, and lessons in French. Let's visit them now, not to envy, but to understand the strange and widening gulf that separated children born into wealth from those born into want. Let's walk quietly now, into a nursery where the fire is always warm. Imagine now that you are waking not in a cold alley, nor a creaking attic, but in a grand house on a quiet crescent street. Beyond the lace curtains, morning sunlight filters through trimmed hedges and over manicured lawns. The floor beneath your feet is not stone, but thick carpet. The air smells faintly of polished wood and lavender water. You are a child in a wealthy Victorian home, and your day will unfold very differently. From the moment of your birth, your place in the world has been marked by care. A governess, often strict but devoted, is assigned to your upbringing. She manages your daily schedule with quiet precision, instructing you in manners, discipline, and the early arts of reading and writing. Later, private tutors will arrive, some from Oxford or Cambridge, paid handsomely to fill your mind with Latin, arithmetic, French, geography, and scripture. You rarely see your parents in an intimate way. Your mother might visit the nursery in the late morning, trailing perfume and silk, to press a cool kiss to your forehead before taking tea. Your father appears in the evenings, reading the paper in the drawing room, content that his children are being well-shaped by professionals. Servants surround you. A nanny to bathe you. A scullery maid to fetch your boots. A cook who prepares soft puddings and jellied fruits. You are dressed, fed, entertained. But for many upper-class children, the experience is oddly lonely. You live in a world shaped for you but rarely with you in mind. The Victorian nursery was both a sanctuary and a training ground. It might be a warm, well-lit room filled with books, hand-painted toys, and a rocking horse carved from pine. But it was also a place of routine. Bedtimes were fixed, nap times enforced. Emotional outbursts were quietly discouraged. Seen and not heard was a phrase many learned young. Still, the resources around you were extraordinary. There were picture books from France, handmade dollhouses, brass kaleidoscopes, and even early phonographs for the wealthiest. Some children learned the piano before the age of 6. Others recited Shakespeare to visiting uncles in waistcoats. Travel was possible too, by rail to country estates, or by steamship across the channel for health and leisure. Ailing children were sent to the seaside for sea air, restless ones to the Alps. But privilege did not guarantee freedom. If you were a boy, your path was likely charted toward boarding school, perhaps Eton or Harrow, where discipline was sharp and affection rare. If you were a girl, your life was more confined. Education emphasized elegance over intellect. Embroidery, etiquette, French conversation. You were taught to prepare for society, for marriage, for managing a household. Your thoughts were expected to stay within the parlor walls. And yet, even within this plush world, a quiet pressure often lingered. To behave, to succeed, to make your family proud. To marry well. To take on the mantle of your class with grace. Emotions were folded beneath pleats and ribbons, expressed in coded gestures rather than open speech. Some children flourished. Others became shadows in silk. Many envied the freedoms of the street boys they glimpsed from the carriage windows, ignorant perhaps of the suffering those boys endured. But that envy was real. In the nursery everything was safe. But little was spontaneous. And sometimes at balls or garden parties, the two worlds brushed against each other. A chimney sweep might be hired to clean a drawing room flue. A street child might slip into the garden to steal a pear. A foundling girl, now a scullery maid, might clear away a nursery tea tray without a word. They were invisible but present. These brief, silent intersections marked the strange fabric of Victorian life. A city where one child learned Latin with a silver quill, while another begged for crusts outside a bakery. Where one slept on embroidered linen, and another on stone. As evening draws in, you, our gentle listener, may now picture both lives. The soft ticking of a nursery clock, the hush of a grand staircase, the quiet footfalls of a child in wool slippers, and elsewhere, the shuffle of bare feet on cobbles, the crackle of frost on broken glass, the sigh of a boy as he curls against a warm chimney, soot still streaking his cheeks. Two worlds, one city, and between them, centuries of memory. Now, as the last candle of the evening flickers low and the weight of the past begins to settle gently over your thoughts, we come to rest. We have wandered far tonight, through alleys thick with soot and parlors hushed with velvet. We've walked beside orphans with blistered hands and children whose slippers never touched the ground. We listened to the voice of a nobleman who gave his life to the silent, the forgotten, the overlooked. And we passed through the great doors of foundling hospitals, where names were lost but hope clung stubbornly, even in the quiet. The Victorian world was not one world, but many. To be a child in that era could mean endless comfort, or endless struggle. It could mean toys carved from ivory or lungs full of coal dust. It could mean private tutors in sunlit rooms, or a stranger's hands guiding you up into a black chimney. And yet, across these gulfs of wealth and class, all children shared something: the need for tenderness, for safety, for the warmth of a name spoken kindly, a hand held in silence, a place to belong. Sometimes that was given, often it was not. But tonight we have remembered them all. Not as footnotes in history, not as symbols of social problems, but as people. Small, curious, resilient, real. Perhaps now, as your own thoughts begin to soften and drift, you can carry a few of their stories with you. Not to burden you, but to comfort you with the quiet knowledge that the world you rest in now, warm, safe and still, was built on the backs of many who never knew such peace. Their voices, faint as they are, still echo in the cobbled streets of London, in the pages of old hospital records, in the faded photographs of children with solemn eyes. And here, in the hush of night, their stories find a resting place beside you. So let your breath slow. Let the past settle. Let the present cradle you gently. You are not in the alleys now. Not in the foundling ward. Not in the nursery of quiet pressure. You are here. Wrapped in time. surrounded by stories. And as the last echoes of soot and silk, sorrow and sanctuary, fade into silence, sleep may take you softly, slowly. Good night, and thank you for listening. As you begin to drift deeper into calmness, we now gently move from the foggy alleys of Victorian street children to something even more hidden behind brick walls and silence. In this second part of your journey into the forgotten corners of history, we'll quietly enter the cold stone corridors of the Victorian workhouse, a place where childhood was stripped to the bone and daily life was reduced to survival. Let yourself relax even more now and enjoy this next story, written especially for deep sleep and gentle dreams. Imagine waking up while it is still dark. There are no curtains to draw aside, no birdsong greeting the sun, just the cold, damp breath of another gray morning. You're sleeping on a wooden plank, or perhaps a straw-stuffed mattress that crackles slightly when you shift. It smells faintly of mildew and something sour, perhaps the stone floor beneath you or the linen, washed but never quite clean. You are 8 years old. The bell rings before daylight. No one speaks. Children rise in silence, just as they were taught. The older boys help the younger ones find their shoes, often mismatched, sometimes held together with string. You quickly pull on your stiff, scratchy uniform. The fabric is coarse. It itches, but you've grown used to it. A gray smock, sometimes brown, with a collar too tight. Everyone looks the same. No color, no ribbons, no difference. Breakfast is called. It is served in a large, echoing hall where the high ceiling makes even the softest sound seem loud. You sit on a bench, back straight, hands in your lap. There is no chatter, no clinking of silver spoons. Talking is forbidden. Breakfast is gruel, watery oats, sometimes clumpy, sometimes burnt. Served in chipped bowls, handed down the line by silent workers who do not meet your gaze. You eat with a wooden spoon. It is warm but not satisfying. You eat quickly, then sit with your hands folded until the bell rings again. Now begins the work. If you are a girl, you might be sent to the laundry. It's a massive room, damp and steaming, with rows of heavy linens and garments hanging like ghosts from ropes. You stand on a stool to reach the washtubs, scrubbing until your fingers sting. Sometimes the soap gets into small cuts and you wince. But there's no time for pain. One of the matrons walks up and down the rows, her heels clicking across the tiles, her eyes watching for any sign of idleness. If you are a boy, you might be sent to the yard to break stones, or to the workroom where you twist coarse fibers into rope, hour after hour. Some children are tasked with picking oakum, pulling apart old ropes with bare fingers, leaving splinters and sores. Others polish shoes, wash floors, or help in the kitchens, carrying heavy pots almost too big for them. There is no playtime. You may be given a short break mid-morning, just enough to stand in the cold and stretch your legs. Then it is back to work until noon, when another bell rings and you line up once more for food. Lunch is more gruel, or sometimes a slice of dry bread and a turnip. No meat, rarely cheese. On Sundays, you might get a bit of suet pudding if the master is feeling generous. But not always. Meals are meant to sustain, not satisfy. Hunger remains your companion. In the afternoons, older children may attend school, if the workhouse provides it. Lessons are stern. Reading, writing, arithmetic. No songs, no painting, no stories. Just slates, chalk, and the voice of a tired teacher reminding you to sit still and pay attention. Mistakes are not scolded loudly, but they are remembered. The day winds on. The light fades early in the workhouse, especially in winter, when fog curls around the windows and the wind whispers through cracks in the walls. By evening you are tired. Not sleepy tired, bone tired. You shuffle in for one last meager meal, then file off to bed. Boys to one dormitory, girls to another. You undress quietly. The matron stands by the door, arms folded. She does not smile. There are whispers in the dark, but they are brief. The children know better. Those who talk too long may be made to stand in the corner for an hour the next day. Or worse, lose a meal. You fall asleep to the sound of coughing, footsteps down the hall, and the faint scurry of a rat in the beams. Your dreams are not vivid. Most nights you don't remember them at all. This is not punishment. This is not prison. This is the poor law system. And for thousands of children across 19th century Britain, this was simply life. But not everyone accepted this quietly. In the next part of our story, we'll follow the journey of one child who experienced the darkest side of labor, and still managed to change the course of history. If you've ever read a novel by Charles Dickens, perhaps Oliver Twist, David Copperfield, or Great Expectations, you've already wandered through the dark streets and silent sorrows of Victorian childhood. But what many don't realize is that Dickens didn't just imagine those cold hallways and ragged boys. He remembered them. To understand how his stories carried so much quiet truth, we must first go back, not to a drawing room or a literary society, but to a dim warehouse by the River Thames. It's the year 1824. Charles is just 12 years old, and his father, once proud, now penniless, has been sent to debtor's prison. With the family shattered and money gone, young Charles is removed from school and placed in a blacking factory, a place where boot polish is bottled and labeled. The building is old, its walls damp with river mist. The floors are always wet, and the smell of wax and soot hangs heavy in the air. The job is tedious and repetitive. Charles spends 10 hours a day pasting labels onto glass jars with a brush. The glue is thick and sour. His fingers are always sticky, and the factory air is cold even in spring. There are rats in the corners, but no one notices them after the first week. He is alone, not just at his work table but inside. His family is separated, his school days cut short, his future uncertain. He is not yet famous. He is not yet anything. Just a quiet, watchful boy among many others. But something happens in those months. He observes. He listens. He memorizes the voices of the boys beside him, the slurred threats of the factory foreman, the way soot settles into the cracks of the floorboards, and the sound of carriage wheels outside, always just out of reach. Years later, when he becomes a writer, these details will pour out of him, not as fantasy but as memory. Mr. Bumble, Fagin, the workhouse, the cruel silence of authority. These are not invented. They are softened reflections of something real. Something he lived. And Charles never forgot what it felt like to be small, unheard, and endlessly tired. After a few months in the factory, Charles's father was released from prison, and the family managed to scrape together enough to send him back to school. But the damage had been done. The memory would never leave him. He later described the experience as one of deep humiliation and despair. He felt abandoned, not just by his parents but by the world. And yet, he transformed that quiet pain into stories that awakened a nation's conscience. It's because of Dickens's vivid portrayals that the world learned to see children in hardship, not just as problems to be solved or mouths to be fed, but as individuals with thoughts, dreams, and fears. His words brought them out of the shadows. So the next time you hear the name Charles Dickens, remember, before he was a famous author, he was a lonely boy sitting in a cold factory, watching everything, and quietly storing it away. In the next part of our story, we'll explore something more elusive, a strange, unsettling institution that promised salvation but often delivered sorrow. We'll walk, gently, into the hidden world of Foundling hospitals, where lost children were taken in, and often forgotten. Imagine, if you will, a quiet knock at the door in the stillness of night. No voice, just the soft rustle of cloth, and a bundle placed carefully on a stone step. Wrapped inside, barely stirring, is an infant. No name, no papers, perhaps a ribbon tied around the wrist, or a note in trembling handwriting. Please care for her. I cannot. In the shadows of Victorian society, where shame and desperation often walked hand in hand, there existed places known as Foundling hospitals. Despite the name, they were not hospitals in the modern sense, but sanctuaries or perhaps last resorts for abandoned children. Our story now shifts into their world. founded in the 18th century but active well into the Victorian era. The most famous of these institutions was the Foundling Hospital in London, established by a sea captain named Thomas Coram. Deeply disturbed by the number of infants left to die in alleyways and rivers, he spent 17 years petitioning the Crown before he was allowed to build a home for them. But even this act of mercy bore a heavy sadness. Entry into the hospital was anonymous. Mothers, most often poor, unmarried, or desperate, would approach the building under the cover of night. A special turning wheel, set into the wall, allowed a baby to be placed gently inside. The wheel would rotate, and the child would be taken in, without the mother being seen. It was a system built for shame and for secrecy. Mothers were instructed to leave a token with their child, something small that could later identify them if they returned. Button, ribbon, a scrap of cloth. Some of these tokens, astonishingly, still survive today, collected like silent cries from the past. But most never returned. And the children grew up without names, without parents, and without stories. Many were given invented surnames like Brown, Smith, or names from the hospital register. Their first years were spent in silence, nursed by hired wet nurses, often in the countryside, then returned to the institution at age 5 to begin education and training. The buildings were strict and orderly. Long rows of narrow beds, like little coffins in the dusk. Uniforms in brown or navy. The children were taught to be neat, respectful, and useful. The boys were trained for service or labor. The girls for domestic work or sewing. There were no toys, no birthdays, no family visits. To outsiders, the hospitals were signs of progress, proof that Victorian society cared for its weakest members. And in many ways they were remarkable efforts. Thousands of children were kept alive who might otherwise have perished. The buildings were clean, the intentions noble, but the cost was invisibility. The foundlings were raised to be grateful, quiet, and indistinct. Their early memories were often marked by separation, institutional discipline, and a deep, vague feeling of being unclaimed, of not belonging. Some found peace in routine. Others remembered only the echo of their own footsteps in long, polished corridors. Historians today still puzzle over the full emotional impact of these institutions. Were they saviors or silencers? Did they offer hope or erase identity? The truth, like much of history, is not simple. But within the mystery of the foundling hospitals lies a poignant truth. Even mercy, when wrapped in secrecy and shame, can leave behind a cold trace. And yet, the children endured. And so now, as we prepare to leave behind the brick walls and echoing dormitories, we'll enter one last world in this journey. A world of soft fabrics, family portraits, gentle music lessons, and warm parlor lights. In our final chapter, we will visit the other side of Victorian childhood, the lives of children who were born into comfort, and who would never know what it meant to live in a workhouse. Imagine waking to the muffled chime of a clock from the hallway below. The morning light filters softly through lace curtains, spilling over velvet drapes and warming the polished wooden floor. A crackling fireplace has already been lit by the servants. The sheets are crisp, the mattress thick, and somewhere downstairs, breakfast is being prepared. You are a child in a wealthy Victorian home. Your day begins not with a bell, but with a knock. A housemaid helps you into your day clothes, perhaps a sailor suit, or a neatly pressed muslin dress with fine embroidery. Your boots are buttoned for you, your hair carefully brushed. You may be just 7 or 8 years old, but your routine is already disciplined, if far more comfortable than others your age. Downstairs, breakfast is laid out in a quiet room. Toast, jam, fresh milk, maybe eggs or kippers. You sit with your siblings if you have any. A nurse or governess might oversee the meal. Your parents are unlikely to be present. Victorian formality dictates separation. Affection is rarely shown, and children are often kept at a respectful distance from adults, even in the same household. After breakfast, your lessons begin. Education for the wealthy is thorough, but highly controlled. You are taught reading, writing, history, and French. If you're a boy, you may study Latin or Greek, mathematics, and sciences. Girls often receive instruction in music, drawing, embroidery, and deportment, the art of sitting, walking, and speaking properly. You learn to walk with a straight spine, to speak softly, and to never interrupt. Manners are paramount. Everything must appear effortless, even when it isn't. Your teacher may be a governess, a woman educated but of lower social rank, living in the house yet not fully part of it. She eats her meals alone. You sense her loneliness, perhaps, but she remains composed. In the afternoons you might play in the garden, supervised of course, or visit the drawing room to practice piano or sketching. There are toys, but they are fragile. Dolls with porcelain faces. Tin soldiers in smart rows. Books with gilded spines. Each story carefully chosen for moral instruction. Outside, through the tall windows, a world of noise and hardship buzzes just beyond the hedges. But it rarely enters here. The house is a bubble of order and scent. Lavender, beeswax, and coal smoke. Dinner is formal, even for children. If you dine with your parents, which is rare, you sit quietly and speak only when spoken to. Servants glide across the floor like shadows, replacing courses and filling crystal glasses with care. Bedtime arrives with ritual. A bath may be drawn, a copper tub near the fire filled by hand. A nurse lays out your nightclothes and tucks you into a warm bed. She might read to you softly or sing a hymn. Then the room goes dark, save for the glow of embers in the fireplace. You are warm, cared for. And yet, even in this cocoon, childhood is not truly free. There are expectations, rules, pressure to behave, to impress, to carry the family name. Every action is observed, every mistake noted. You are not beaten, perhaps, but nor are you often hugged. Emotion, in upper-class Victorian homes, was often something to be managed, not expressed. And still your life is quieter, softer, removed from the cold streets and stone corridors where so many others sleep. In the same city on the same night, a child your age might be sweeping a chimney, or crying alone in a workhouse bed. Two worlds, same age, same year, different lives entirely. Tonight, we walked slowly through the hushed streets of Victorian England, not with grand speeches or battles, but with the quiet footsteps of forgotten children. We began in the damp alleys and smoky attics, where orphans and street children survived one long day at a time. Their lives, filled with soot, blisters, and invisible suffering, remind us how childhood can be stripped of joy and still endure. We met the young Charles Dickens, not yet a writer, just a boy in a blacking factory. His hands sticky with paste and his mind storing everything he saw. And we understood how pain can sometimes become purpose. Then we wandered through the locked doors of the Foundling hospitals, where babies were left behind with buttons and ribbons. Raised in a place of mercy, yet marked by silence. A world meant to save, but often to forget. Finally, we stepped into carpeted halls and quiet parlors, where the rich children of the Victorian age awoke in warm beds, spoke when spoken to, and were carefully shaped to carry their family's name and pride. And now, as you rest in your own soft bed, in a room of your choosing, in a time where warmth and safety are more certain, you might carry with you just a whisper of their lives. Not to mourn, but to remember. Because every cobbled alley, every worn-out shoe, every stitched uniform in a Foundling home, and every quiet child behind a schoolroom desk, was part of the same world, the same century, the same city. History is not only made in palaces and parliaments. It breathes in kitchens, stairwells, alleyways, and the eyes of children who were never photographed. Let their stories settle in you gently now. Let the rhythm of their days slow your own. And as sleep pulls you deeper, know that these stories, though filled with hardship, are told not to trouble you, but to calm and connect and quietly endure. Good night, and thank you for listening to Boring History for Sleep.
you.